Can we give a big warm welcome for Simon?
Hi, everybody. So, over the course of my career in design, I've seen a lot of things change, and of course, the technologies and the mediums have changed, but also the way that we make decisions. And, how do we decide what's good? How do we decide what we should put out there in the world? Some of these changes have been influenced by expansions of the field, the intersections with other disciplines that have come in and introduced new techniques and new methods. And others have been driven by technology. So the fact that we can see people's behavior in real time and at a distance, at scale. And every time that design expands in this way, there's those that view these new sets of possibilities with nuance, and they place them inside of an existing toolkit. They make that toolkit larger. And there's also people that view these new possibilities through the lens of it being a niche, that it's something that they take as a chance to leave the old techniques behind and just 100% embrace this new way of doing things. I want to talk about 3 different ways that we might make decisions, that some of you in the room are making decisions. And I want to talk about why we would choose one over another and how we might use them together. So that alphabetical list is nice, but I'm going to start with creativity. And that's because this is a little bit of a personal journey, and that, for me, is where my career started. I got into design because of how it made me feel. It wasn't about ideas at first. It wasn't even something where I had a clear sense of what it meant to be a professional designer. I'd spend hours flipping through album covers in the record store and book covers in the library. I loved poster design that captured the energy and excitement of an event. And I was obsessed with this idea that form and function could work in concert, but that within that goal, there was this, innumerable ways to solve problems, that a group of designers could take the exact same set of constraints and apply their own creativity to make a unique and original outcome. So that was my introduction to design. That's how I got into it. And it's also core to the way that I was educated. So I studied graphic design in a very Swiss tradition at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. So Midwest, represent, of course. And I would spend days drawing letter forms by hand. I'd be mixing paint to understand color perception, and really learning first principles, learning through trial and error. And we didn't do this to learn the rules of design, but to better understand the materials that we were working with, to know the possibilities, to build an intuition around them, and ultimately so that we could combine them into some creative outcome. And when I talk about a creative approach to decision making, that's what I'm referring to, this idea of personal creativity, of an individual using the materials of design to not only solve a problem, but to do it in a unique way. Creativity means more than just following standards or combining some sort of standard elements in a way that gets you that baseline functionality. Done well, it achieves that, but with a little bit of surprise, with something that can spark something special, get a reaction, stand out, maybe even be provocative. So let's dig into this approach. How do you decide when you're done? How do you decide what good looks like? In my experience, it's generally a mix of these two. You have intuition and critique. Intuition that you've built up through years of practicing your craft, studying history, developing an eye for what works, and critique as this check and balance, not just getting feedback from other designers, but being required to really defend your ideas, to articulate and justify a decision while still being open to suggestion. And I want to dig into what each one of these approaches looks like. So I want to look at what are some common activities that we'd associate with each approach. So in creativity, a common activity would be experimentation, using trial and error to uncover creative possibilities, building to think. Things like metaphorical matching, so seeing the world with new eyes, seeing one thing for something else, playing games where you swap inputs and outputs to see what would happen, like this, but for that. Embracing serendipity through randomness, through conversation, through taking a walk in the neighborhood, through play. You have to create the conditions for serendipity to emerge. Through unconventional choices, really purposefully choosing the slow, hard, unproven road less traveled. And through iteration. So practicing, repeating, throwing things away, version after version. We sometimes think of creativity as being this spark, this moment of creativity, but underneath that, behind the scenes, there's this relentless iteration that's happening. So why would you choose to use a creativity-based approach to make decisions? Well, maybe you want to make a statement. This can be very good for that. Bring a strong point of view to a problem. Create something with a clear identity. It's great for getting an emotional reaction, grabbing attention, making a splash, making someone smile, like really designing for how someone feels, not just for does it meet the usable functionality of something. It's good for reinvention. So if you're working on a project where you really want to do an image overhaul, a makeover, you're relaunching with new energy and momentum. And it can be great for shifting thinking about a problem space, making people see the world in a new way, breaking through the homogeny of existing products, and inventing something new. So at IDEO, this is a framework we end up using all the time called Ways to Grow. And it's just a very simple 2x2 that helps us think through whether a client is interested in attracting new users, creating some kind of new offering, or just improving what they already have. And if I had to pick a quadrant, I'd say creativity is best for a big change. It's new offerings with new users. A final point that I want to make for each of these approaches is how it changes the relationship between a designer and a user when you use these, a particular approach to decision making, how it influences that. And for creativity, I would describe that relationship as kind of like giving a gift. It's saying, I know that you haven't seen something like this before, but I think you're going to like it, and putting it out in the world. You've created something for somebody else, but in some ways it also embodies you. It's saying, I like this, and I think you will too. Of course, there's something missing in a creativity-driven approach, and I think a lot of us in this room have kind of gone through this discovery in our careers. What's missing? Non-designers. You don't always give people the right gift, and it'd be pretty narcissistic to think that your point of view is always going to be right for somebody else. So relying on creativity solely can be a kind of Hail Mary. If you build it, they will come kind of approach. And sometimes nobody shows up. So let's talk about design thinking or human-centered design. I don't want to get hung up on particular terms, but I think we know what we're talking about. So back to me, back in time, it was the early 2000s, and I was working for an advertising agency and designing and building websites. I loved the web, and that has been just the basis of my career and interests in this field, growing up at the same time as the web. And at that time, there were these rapid browser upgrades. The Flash plugin was like at the height of its popularity and possibilities. And it felt like creativity was finding a voice in this new medium. And that was exciting. But there was also something missing. The things that I was creating, they did a good job of solving a problem. They worked. They worked as a design solution. They were creative and they were unique. But I often had this nagging feeling of, am I even designing the right thing? I was involved in how something should come to life, but I really didn't have any input into what or whether it should be in the first place. So I was using creativity to solve problems, but were they the right ones? And I realized I needed to get involved, or wanted to get involved in problem discovery as well. So I went back to grad school, to Carnegie Mellon, where, Carnegie Mellon shout-outs? Okay. And I learned more about this approach. I learned about design research and systems design and interaction design. And more than the interaction between a person and a computer, I saw how design could shape interactions between people, with their environment, with society. And the larger themes of how I was expanding my approach to design at that time was all about people, other people, people that weren't like me. And whether we call it human-centered design or design thinking, this approach is defined by looking outside of ourselves, right? It's about finding inspiration in the world and grounding our designs in the needs of others. And so after grad school, I went to work at IDEO, and it's where I've spent the bulk of my career. And it's a company with a really strong history and role in defining and championing this type of design. It's given me the opportunity to work across a really wide range of problem spaces, living with diabetes, managing your money, driving an automobile, performing a medical procedure. And at the end of every project, the thing that I really enjoy about it is that now I do have that confidence that we're designing the right thing and that it makes people's lives a little bit better. So let's go through the same exercise with this. What does design thinking look like in contrast to other approaches? So it begins with people, as we've talked about, looking for that sweet spot with technology and business, but really entering in through people. It involves in-context observation, because people say and do different things, so we really need to listen and observe in everyday natural settings. It involves empathy building, which in the situation I'm talking about is about trying to see the world through other people's eyes, acknowledging and breaking down our own biases and our own existing worldviews. And lots of rapid prototyping, often at a really low fidelity to get feedback from users throughout the process, letting them tweak and fix things and just not get attached to any one direction too strongly. Finally, the process is really characterized by these moments of divergence and convergence, going through these cycles of abstract and concrete thinking, zooming in and out to see the problem at different scales. So let's dig into why you should use it as a comparison. So as I mentioned, the confidence that you can have in the solution through that continual input and evaluation. The fact that it can give you principles for future designs, right? User insights can apply more broadly than a single product. So it can inform other initiatives and set a strategic direction beyond just one project. It helps you mitigate risk. New product development, very expensive. Prototyping helps you fail earlier. And one thing I've seen a lot in working with many different clients is that can really help you reconnect with the purpose behind what you're doing. So it's a side effect of going out and talking to talking to people who use your products. It reminds them of why they're doing this, why they work for this organization to begin with. And that alignment of work and purpose can really unlock a lot of new potential and motivation in people. If we look again at the ways to grow diagram, design thinking gets associated with the idea of innovation, but I think that inspiration from users doesn't necessarily lead to radical change lots of times. Its sweet spot is along an axis that you already know really well, so deepening relationships with existing customers or gaining new ones. And let's talk about the relationship that is different between the designer and the user in this approach. The designer is really in service of the user, prioritizing their needs and interests and goals. It's less, I made this and I hope you'll like it, and more, here's the thing that we made together. So the designer brings their expertise to bear, but it's in service of, or in the best cases, in collaboration with the users. Of course, the process of talking to and observing people takes a lot of time. It can be slow. Neither the problem nor the solution is going to jump out at you. It's this messy process that emerges from intuition and feedback and synthesis and iteration. What if we could just measure what people want? What if we could test a design that removes any doubt that it's the right thing? So I recently left IDEO and then returned to IDEO, and this is a common enough occurrence at the company that there's a name for it, so I guess I'm officially a boomerang. And in between my 2 times at the company, I worked for a startup. I worked for the language learning company, Duolingo, which I'm sure many of you have on your phones right now. The app has millions of users. But when I started, I was surprised to learn how little the company knows about them. I'd ask my coworkers in the first week of work, who's our target audience? Why do people choose Duolingo over other apps? And there were some anecdotal stories, but there weren't really any good answers. And that's because Duolingo uses a very different approach to understanding their users. Rather than segmenting people by behavior or motivation, they look at them as one large group, or rather 2 groups, A and B. So at Duolingo, everything is A/B tested. It is a mandate, a mantra, a must. And for tech companies, this is not particularly unusual. The founder of the company and many of my coworkers had previously worked for Google. And with its massive scale and its well-known penchant for data, Google has had a huge influence on the decision-making cultures of tech companies. So let's talk about A/B testing. We'll just dive into what does it look like. So to do an A/B test, you first have to pick some kind of quantifiable metric. So this is what you're testing against, and it has to be a single quantifiable event. So we're talking number of clicks, purchase conversion time, time on page, number of shares, these sorts of things. You need to create a design variation. So this can be the entire page, or it can be just a small tweak of some kind. But to best determine causality, you want to break down the test into the smallest possible components and change that you can. And then you need to split users into 2 buckets. And this is done on the fly. So people are assigned a bucket when they load the app or the website that's running the test. And this helps you make sure that these buckets are balanced and make sure that the users are randomly chosen. You collect data, you run the experiment enough times that you have enough data to have a statistically significant result. And you decide when to stop based on the accuracy that you're comfortable with. So maybe you're comfortable when 95% confidence that B is better than A. So then you determine the winner, you stop the test, you launch the winner. Okay, so why would you use this approach? Well, you're looking at actual behavior. These are real users under real conditions in the live product. You can learn about very small differences. So we can measure variations of just a percentage or two. And this can make a big difference at scale. It's not something that you would necessarily pick up on in a qualitative test. It gives you definitive answers. This is good, or can be good, for resolving disputes. If there's some kind of difference of opinion, you can point towards the confidence level of a test as a way of resolving that. And it's great for optimization. So A/B testing helps you know that you've squeezed every last bit of potential out of a design that you're working on. On the ways to grow diagram, it's really clear where A/B testing falls. It focuses on optimizing your existing product for existing users. And with this approach, the relationship between designer and user is more distant. It's more abstract. User behavior is looked at as an aggregate, this statistical group. And the design is really hyper-focused on meeting an objective that may or may not improve the user experience. And that's because A/B testing is most often optimized for more engagement. The number of clicks, the time in the app, the number of shares, and more engagement is not necessarily correlated with a better experience. At its best, the relationship between a designer and a user in this approach is kind of like a benevolent overlord. So I was thinking of like a highway planner, somebody who is tweaking traffic lights and on-ramps and really thinking about the traffic as a whole, not as any one individual driver, smoothing the flow of cars and avoiding accidents. I think at its worst, though, it can be manipulative. It can shape people's behavior bit by bit, deploying psychological tricks to optimize a business metric. And I'm going to dig deeper into that and some problematic aspects of it. But first, I want to make a key point about the three different approaches that we walk through. Why go through in such detail, especially when I think many of us are roughly familiar with some of these. I've teased them apart because I think it's really useful for us to reflect on what each one is good for, because they're all good for something. They're all best for something. And it's rarely the right decision to use just one. Ungrounded creativity can lead to products that nobody wants or understands. Design thinking can get stuck in the present or remain too high level. And A/B testing can be too narrow and end up kind of stymieing holistic thinking. So rather than advocate for one type of decision making, I want to encourage this idea of nuanced combination. And that is a gray area, right? It's a both and, it's moderation, and seemingly everything in our society these days is all about niche extremes and getting attention through strong points of view. It's just easier to say, I'm going to pick an approach and just do things that way. But I'm increasingly afraid of what that looks like. So I think we have to ask ourselves, what approach best answers my question? How does this approach influence my relationship to users? And am I okay with that? And what might be the unintended consequences? So let's go back to A/B testing. I want to focus more here because its star is rising. More and more companies are turning to this approach for everything. And the first time I heard about A/B testing was the oddly specific date of March 20th, 2009, because that's when Douglas Bowman, Google's first visual designer, made a blog post about leaving his job. And in that post, he confirmed an anecdote that was published a couple weeks earlier in the New York Times about how Google had tested 41 different shades of blue in a recent toolbar redesign. He also mentioned a situation where he was asked to prove whether an element he was designing should have a 3, 4, or 5 pixel border on it. And basically, he was fed up. And, you know, I can't blame him. And that's how I felt, at least when I read it initially. These were the very early days of design at Google. And it seemed to symbolize a culture clash between design and engineering. In design circles, it was seen as Google having no sense of taste and no visual literacy. But if we look back to the why section about A/B testing, it might actually be an okay choice for the kinds of things that he was talking about. So this is from the September, October, the current issue of Harvard Business Review. And it's an article about how Microsoft Bing A/B tested colors for the titles and captions in their search engine. So this is the test. These are the color palettes. And the difference between these two color palettes, and I'm not sure how much this projector is affecting how you see it. I apologize for that. But the difference between these two color palettes influenced user behavior in a way that increased or would increase revenue by more than $10 million a year. Yeah. Not what you'd expect. So that's what the team thought too. They were like, this can't be true. So they went back and tested it, this time with a larger group with 32 million users, and they got similar results. So the article notes that there are no well-established theories about color that could help them understand why this happened. They said evidence took the place of theory. So here's an example of a simple question focused on optimization that provides quantifiable evidence of enormous impact. It's a pretty good case for A/B testing. But there's a danger to this kind of story because it focuses on a simple example with huge return on investment, and it implies that these kind of wins are just waiting to be found everywhere. The article ends by encouraging companies to take up this approach, and it talks about the scientific rigor of running controlled product experiments. And, you know, this is a seductive term, particularly for management, right? But what it does is it glosses over the limitations and the limited situations where A/B testing is appropriate. And I think it's interesting that both Anna and I today are both reaching back to the Nielsen-Norman archives, but, you know, I think one of the clearest examples of the limits of A/B testing can be found in this article. In 2005, it was published. So I'm just going to let Jacob break it down. A/B testing can only be used for projects that have one clear, all-important goal. That is to say, a single KPI, or key performance indicator. Furthermore, this goal must be measurable by a computer by counting simple user actions. Simple enough so far. A/B testing only works for fully implemented designs. He goes on to say that in contrast, paper prototyping lets you try out several different ideas in a single day. The biggest problem with A/B testing is that you don't know why you get the measured results. He continues that you're not observing the users or listening in on their thoughts. All you know is that statistically, more people performed a certain action with design A than with design B. And sure, this supports the launch of design A, but it doesn't help you move ahead with other design decisions. Worst of all, A/B testing provides data only on the element you're testing. He notes that it's not an open-ended method like user testing, where users often reveal stumbling blocks that you never would have expected. So the advantages, which we talked about, and the limitations, which we talked about, of A/B testing are pretty well known and have been for some time. It provides ample reason to use it sparingly and in a targeted manner. And yet, increasingly, companies are choosing it as their primary or only way of making decisions. So this is Booking.com, and they are a proud pioneer in this regard. So I ran across a presentation at a Google-sponsored conference last March. This gentleman named Stuart Frisbee, who's the director of design, gave a talk about building a testing culture. And he noted that they have more than 150 designers at Booking, and they run more than 1,000 separate tests at any given time. He also said that over 90% of them fail. So it's not that Booking is particularly bad at coming up with ideas to test. This number is surprisingly standard. The HBR article that we were talking about, it notes that at Google and Bing, only about 10 to 20% of experiments generate positive results. And remember, each one of those is a fully implemented design. You don't know why it failed, and it only provides data on the specific element being tested. 90%. So, of course, if you're running thousands of tests, you are not just tweaking colors and border widths. Organizations that have built a testing culture like Booking and Google and Duolingo, they test every single product decision. They test things like, should we sort product reviews chronologically or with positive reviews first? Should we show users who else is online right now? Should we let people edit their usernames? Should we create a way to report an offensive post? Even core questions of product strategy are decided through testing. And these decisions, these are not skin deep. These make up the tone and tenor of your product. They enable or constrain communication between your users. They shape their behavior. And yet they're tested in a manner in which there must be one clear, all-important goal, measurable by a computer. And of course, only the winner survives. I'm just concerned because it's very difficult to create a holistic system when even the smallest of features is broken down into testable parts and then evaluated on its own. Stuart from Booking suggests that we even avoid trying to create these holistic systems. He calls for companies to throw out the roadmap and just trust the process and go where the tests take you. And that philosophy can really damage holistic thinking at the product level, but even feature-level cohesiveness can be threatened by this approach because single features are then broken down into ever smaller components and tested separately, where each piece of a feature has to prove its worth independently. And I don't know about you, but this just makes me claustrophobic. It makes me feel like I'm down in a cavern and I can't get my bearings about where we're headed, like I'm driving in dense fog. And this kind of attitude, it's not just a one-off. This kind of attitude towards decision-making can get baked into the culture and structure of an organization, into how teams work together. It's common for companies with strong testing cultures to organize teams into these small squads where a designer and a couple engineers just hyper-focus on one small area of the product and one small KPI and just optimize the shit out of it. And it kind of reminds me of fantasy football fans in some ways, like just having no allegiance to the home team and focusing just on the stats of individual players. I think you divide a design team into these ever smaller feature squads, and you're no longer working as a team. You can't generate a great user experience by just stitching together these individually optimized components. And I believe that the zeal behind this testing culture, this idea that we're going to just take it on as the only way to do things, I think it comes from this idea of scientific rigor. But if you look just a few pages over in the exact same issue of Harvard Business Review, you find an article by Roger Martin and Tony Goldsby Smith where they ask the question, is business a science? That word tends to get attached to anything that we want to take seriously. But the authors go all the way back to Aristotle, the originator of scientific thinking, and they note that he set clear boundaries around what it should be used for. In his conception, science was about understanding natural phenomena that cannot be other than they are. So why does the sun rise every day? Why do lunar eclipses happen when they do? Why do objects fall to the ground? And what they argue is that the scientific method has limited value to strategy and innovation because the behavior of customers will never be transformed by a product whose design is based on the analysis of their past behavior. So Roger Martin, one of the authors, has put it more bluntly elsewhere, noting that data is only ever backwards looking. There's no such thing as a measurement of the future. So there's a danger for businesses who are building kind of too strong of a testing culture. If you only ever look backwards, you can only learn about the people that are already using your product. 90% of your tests are going to fail, and you don't know why, so there's no way to improve them in the future. Looking backwards means you're optimizing to reach a local maximum, but you're missing the path to the next highest peak, and it's not clear how to get there. When businesses are really young and leading their market, an optimization mindset might work fine. And maybe that's why this is so popular in startups. But longevity requires strategy and innovation. You have to break out of that optimization mindset at some point. To that end, Martin and Goldsby Smith argue for narrative and metaphor as tools that let you break out of the past. They say that science explains the world as it is. A story imagines the world as it could be. But there's also a danger for designers. And this is, for obvious reasons, more near and dear to my heart. A/B testing takes control away from designers. Designers make the artifacts that drive the tests, but they are a step removed from deciding what should be implemented. And there's this article in Fast Company the other month that I thought was really interesting. It's called "Have Designers Lost Control of Design?" Matt Webb talks with a reporter in this article and brings up some interesting questions. He notes that increasingly the thing that generates the most money or that people use the most wins. So he's talking about A/B testing. And he asks, so who actually designed that? And, if you look at that question through the lens of ego, you might answer, who cares? Who cares who designed that? Why do we have to pinpoint that? But I think it's bigger than that. It's not about authorship. It's about ethics. We're at a point in technology and society where it's very clear that there's an ethical component to the systems that we design. But what works best in an A/B test is not necessarily what we want as a society. So fake news. It drives more engagement on Facebook because outrage makes people share more. Gamification amplifies meaningless interactions to the level of obsession and daily anxiety. This optimization for engagement creates a kind of zero-sum warfare for our attention, and companies are increasingly playing dirty. They're using psychological tricks to pull us back into their platforms. This guy, Tristan Harris, he's a founder of an organization called Time Well Spent, and he talks at length about these concerns. He calls it the race to the bottom of the brainstem. And if you haven't seen his work, I highly recommend checking it out. He's got a great TED Talk and some great articles at timewellspent.io. So I'm concerned that, even as consciousness is rising, that designers need to ground their work in ethics. And that's great that that conversation is happening. We find ourselves in decision-making cultures with diminished influence. How do we fight for meaningful, humane design when everything we do has to conform to a limited, singular, short-term metric? I think we have to make the case. We have to show the value of multiple approaches. We have to show the strengths and weaknesses of different techniques and be careful ourselves not to advocate for just one. We need to let each approach play to its strengths and make sure that we're using them appropriately. Even Booking.com does qualitative research. It's just that they then use that to funnel ideas into A/B tests. It's not about going through the motions or making sure you've checked the boxes in the process. It's about how decisions are made. The ways that we can design for people have changed a lot over the course of my career. We have new ways to find inspiration, new techniques for prototyping, and new ways to observe behavior of people at scale. We need to keep adding to that set of tools, staying cognizant of what works best and evangelizing for pluralistic nuance, not dogmatic niches. Thanks.